Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. Welcome to Tech Talks Live Learning. My name is Taylor. I'm with JTB Business Travel and very glad to be hosting this live learning session. Thank you so much for joining. This Tech Talks is a special one since it is part two of a three-part Tech Talks series, and we have a returning special guest with us from Prime Numbers Technology, who will be our Tech Talker for this session. So we're very much looking forward to that. And just as a reminder, we will be hosting these Tech Talk sessions through July and also August. You may have noticed in the registration link there are others you can sign up for. So please continue to register and join us for these insider looks that our technology partners and industry leaders are teaming up with us on. You don't want to miss them. So we really hope that you'll enjoy today's session and find it informative and helpful to you and your company and travelers. So we want to get this session rolling by offering some housekeeping tips. This session is in listen-only mode. That means you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. This will help to keep background noise levels down during the session and make this Tech Talks experience an enjoyable one for all of you. That being said, if you have any questions during today's session, please send those to us using the questions box. And if you haven't located where that is yet, you can find that tool on your GoToWebinar control panel. It's a really great feature, so please use it for sending us any questions that you have today during the session. And during today's session, there will be polls that will activate, and you'll receive a prompt on your screen when we do that. And when you see that prompt appear, just go ahead and respond to the poll by selecting your answer within the poll box. And as a note, this Tech Talk session will be recorded. So if needed, you can request a copy of the recording from us by replying to the email you received upon registration or sending us an email at businesstravel@jtbusa.com. So to get right into our session, here's what you have to look forward to for today. We'll begin with some introductions, and we'll have two speakers today, Ash Shrava of JTB Business Travel, and our special guest tech talker, Kate Saab of Prime Numbers Technology. So we're looking forward to hearing all about this service powered by Prime Numbers Technology. And we're looking forward to this topic being well covered, but as mentioned, if you have any questions during the session, don't hesitate to send those in preparation of our question and answer session, which will happen at the conclusion of today's session. So at this point, I'm pleased to introduce Ash, my boss and the general manager here at JTB Business Travel. And Ash will go ahead and keep things moving along for us. Ash, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Taylor. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you all for joining today. I want to welcome everybody to today's session and want to thank you all for joining. We have folks here from Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific, so we thank you for your participation in today's session. And very importantly, I want to thank Kate for being here today and giving our clients so much information that you will be hearing about a little bit later. I want to start off the call with giving you all some information. This information was covered to some degree in a previous part that we had to this part two's three-part series. My apologies. And I want to talk about our business intelligence offering at JTB Business Travel. So the business intelligence offering is a composition of a lot of different services, but I want to focus the attention on two of them, one of them being the travel reports service and the other one being the travel analytics service. It is important to know that these are the services that we offer to our clients from a report and data perspective, and the travel report service that you are currently using today is a service that was launched about 4 years ago, and it is a service that you're consuming today in the form of getting your monthly reports via email, and in some cases logging into a dashboard and getting access to data and reports. So we are going to be transitioning all of you from the travel report service into the travel analytics service, and I'll talk about the transition in just a couple of minutes here. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want to enhance your experience and your overall overall usage of travel data. And so those of you who joined the Part 1 series that Kate was hosting with us last month, you saw the power of the service and the product. Today, of course, we'll be talking about benchmarking, but we want to make sure that you understand that we are creating this transition for the purposes of ensuring that you all have a higher level of technology at your fingertips. So the way we think about travel analytics and the service around travel analytics, which includes benchmarking, is that when it comes to business decisions, analytics is what you use to make that decision. And so we think that travel should be looked upon in the same way. Now, the future of data, of course, as many say, is not in running reports and filtering it, but actually making it actionable. And our feeling on that is very simple, that the future is actually now. So no longer are we thinking about it as the future, we're saying it's actually here today. And the Travel Analytics Portal is going to be your pathway to being able to take action on travel costs and measure your travel program. So it's truly a wonderful experience, and it's super easy to use, and you saw some of that for those of you who joined the Part 1 of the series. You'll see a lot more of that today when Kate starts her part of the presentation. But all of this is made possible because we at JTB Business Travel have formed a very strong partnership with a technology called Prime Numbers Technology. And as you can see from all the facts and stats, they've been around for a long time, and of course are working with some of the best of the best. So we are very confident that you all, as our clients, will like the product, you will love the product, and you will enjoy using the service. So do pay close attention to Kate as she talks about benchmarking today. From a transition schedule perspective, we're in the transition mode right now of moving all of you from the reporting product or travel reports to travel analytics, and the timeline is well underway. So over the course of the next 30, 60 days, you will see this transition actually occur and conclude by the end of August. And as part of that, you'll all be given new logins to access the Travel Analytics portal. And of course, your monthly reports will now be delivered by Travel Analytics versus the previous solution that you are getting those reports from today. So in all of this is an important step that you will have to take, which is that you want to make sure that you speak to your client services manager to ensure that you are getting these new logins and have access to the Travel Analytics portal. And of course, there's a process for requesting this, and we want to ensure that we're not just delivering logins to anybody who is not going to use the product, but more so based on a use of the service and the product. So of course, for those of you that were part of the previous session, you know the strength of it, and of course, you're probably very excited about getting your hands on it, and we do appreciate your interest. And so as this is a transition process, we want to make sure that you all have plenty of time to ensure that. So as Taylor had mentioned earlier, this is a three-part series, and we want to ensure that you all have a complete picture of the power of the service that we've been talking about since June. And so there is a part 3 to this, and I want to make sure that all of you join that, because the shift will move from benchmarking to expense analysis, and that's definitely one that you don't want to miss. So with that, Taylor, I'll turn it, actually I'll turn it over to Kate. So Kate, the floor is all yours, and thank you again for being here today, and we appreciate your time with all of us.
Great. Thank you for inviting me and having me, discuss benchmarking today. I know benchmarking is one of those things that is super exciting, and people talk around it, around the dinner table about it, and it comes up in conversations with all of your friends all the time. So I'm really glad that we're covering it today. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. And
yep, you're good to go.
And to kind of pick up where Ash left off, as part of this 3-part series, what we covered in the first part of the series was goal setting and understanding how to use goals and ROI in Prime to look at your travel program baseline. We also looked at setting program goals, identifying the goals that matter most to your program and why, and then determining kind of what the information is telling you. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about benchmarking because they tie in. Goals in Prime measure where you actually stand versus a selected benchmark. So today the focus is on benchmarking. And another word about that, people tend to learn about analytical concepts like benchmarking and start embedding them in their practice because they come up in the industry, or they're a buzzword, or it's something that just kind of evolves. But we don't often take the time to step back and look at something from a 10,000 feet perspective and understand it in concept. And I think today will help you apply the concepts much better as you move forward if you're using it today. And we'll talk more about that as we move through. So today we're going to discuss what benchmarking is and what it is not, what types of benchmarks exist, and when to use each, which is key, what benchmarks matter in travel specifically and why. We're going to talk about gaps in benchmarking and how to get started. All right, so what is benchmarking? So benchmarking is a way to gain perspective about how well you perform compared with other companies. It's a way to drill down into performance gaps and identify areas for improvement. It's a way to guide development of standard practices and metrics, to enable a mindset and culture of continuous improvement, and to set performance measurements and expectations. When we talked about goals in our first part of the series, we talked about setting that baseline, understanding the performance measurement as that baseline, and setting expectations relative to a benchmark comparison or your own company historically, which is just a different type of benchmark. So what benchmarking is not? It's not a one and done thing. Benchmarking gives you those tools to implement a model of continuous improvement, and it's part of an iterative process that you have to adapt to your organization. So just like your company grows and changes, the benchmarks and the metrics you choose to compare yourself against, the KPIs you choose, the goals you set, change over time. If your policy changes, you should really reevaluate your goals, your KPIs, and the benchmarks you're using. If you pick up a subsidiary company, if you purchase another entity, if you grow significantly in new markets, or change core business practices, all things that should be reevaluated. Okay, and the thought for today is continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. Mark Twain, known as America's favorite author, man of many quotes. This one I feel is ideal to speak to benchmarking and the process that we should undertake when considering benchmarking.
Great. I think that's an amazing quote. Thank you for sharing that. So let's get into a poll that we would like you all to help us answer, so all the attendees. So go ahead and respond to the question of how is your company currently using benchmarking? And so you have some options there. One is that you get data from travel industry sources. So maybe you're using ARC or GBTA or some other organization to get that information. Maybe you're using prime numbers via your client services manager. Others might be comparing against yourself, or maybe you're not using benchmarking at all. So let's go ahead and get some responses. So take your time there and fill in the box, and then Taylor will share with all of us the results as soon as we have enough responses. Okay. So so here's the results from the poll, and as we can see here, we have about 25% of the audience actually using prime numbers technology and relying on prime numbers technology for the benchmarking, and then there's about 58% that are either not using benchmarking or getting it from other sources, and then we have about 17% comparing against themselves. So that's a good spread of responses there, and I think that what all of you will hear from Kate is of course how benchmarking can be used within the prime numbers technology. And so Kate, what do you think about this? I think you have a lot of audience members today that are actually in need of understanding benchmarking.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good mix. I think it's really common for people to start out benchmarking against themselves, which is a healthy place. It's part of that establishing baseline, sorry. But I also think that you guys are going to learn some new skills today that will really help you kind of take your benchmarking practice to the next level. I hope. All right. And I'll get to the next slide here. So it kind of brings us into the kinds of benchmarks. So some of you are using internal benchmarks today, and we're going to talk about internal benchmarking, strategic benchmarking, which is kind of a cross hatch of different types of benchmarking, competitive benchmarking, and generic. Some people say generic benchmarking isn't necessarily benchmarking at all, and we'll look at that. And it is true. It is a metrics-based way of looking at your program versus the world. So it's not necessarily taking into account a specific benchmark data set, although it can. So some experts say there's only 3 kinds. I say there's 4. Benchmarking options in Prime. So when you first log into Prime on the home screen, one of the things you do is edit your criteria set, and you can select the date range, the company you're working with, a specific department. You can also set your benchmark, and in editing your benchmark, you have specific choices. So what I've done here is align these with the types of benchmarking that are conceptually available in the world, right? So internal benchmarking is all about comparing against your own company. Competitive benchmarking can be strategic. Competitive benchmarking can be based on industry, and strategic can be based on pretty much everything else. Strategic has to do with looking at country, world, region, looking at online bookings, although strategic benchmarking can also encompass other elements. So you can look at industry, you can look at similar spend. And then metrics-based is all of the above. Metrics-based is looking at metrics at a wide scale outside in the market. So we'll look at each type, we'll talk about the definition of each, and then look at a use case for each, and kind of tie that back to how you would use that in travel. So internal benchmarking. So this is a comparison of a business process to a similar process inside your organization. Everybody travels in your company. So you're comparing to your own company, period over period, looking at incremental improvement over time, or not. You're looking by hierarchy, by department, by cost center, against your own company. The benchmark here shows that this particular company doubled versus themselves last year. The pros to using this approach, it's really easy to do. You can look at your data year over year. You don't necessarily need a benchmark data source. It provides a deeper understanding of your internal process. So essentially looking at growth, looking at specific markets that you entered, it just allows you to kind of look at what you're doing without any kind of noise from the outside world. It yields insights on process variance by hierarchy. That's a real fancy way of saying that by department, you might have variances depending on, how that department functions and how they operate when they travel. And then the cons. So it may not yield a best-in-class approach, meaning if you're only comparing against yourself, you have no way of knowing whether that's the best in class or that your processes are perfect. Internal bias has more to do with that process perfection. If you only compare internally, you have no measure to say that, maybe there's a way to do things better. And then the cons. It can create internal competition. This could also be a pro depending on your company. But if you're sharing benchmark information internally and you happen to be part of a competitive company, that's great. If your company isn't really competitive internally, but it's driving this type of competition and it's unwanted, it can be a con. Now, the use cases for internal benchmarking, when you have established best practices, your policy is dialed in, you have all of your kind of ducks in a row. It's a really good way. It's also good to look at when there aren't comparable entities available. Maybe within your industry, you're a unicorn and there's nobody who quite does business the way you do. Or potentially you're so large that there aren't comparable entities in so many of your key markets. You just dominate. It's good for comparing some part against the whole, a department against the whole company, and used to drive and measure internal goals. So looking at the grid that we have here, I could use this really readily to create goals for each department. Let's say my goal was, to monitor and maintain cost increases over time. Set a 50% or a 10% cap on cost increases year over year. It's really easy to see not only what these particular departments did in a prior period, but how they're doing against each other. So the sales department has a really low kind of average fare, and the corporate department is really high and really high relative to last year. So it would let me drive to an internal goal and maybe measure and see what's going on with that particular department, what may have changed. So strategic benchmarking. Strategic benchmarking is a comparison of a business process to a similar process outside of the immediate industry, meaning you can look at companies of similar spend. You can look at companies by geography, by agent versus online bookings or policy enforcement within Prime. The example here is showing airlines, specific airline usage, my company versus the benchmark. It's very broad, so it provides trend information on a wide scale, which is a good thing. It provides metrics-based comparisons, meaning I'm not going to look at behavior. You know, the one department books differently or travels differently than another. I'm merely looking at the metrics. What's the average fare comparison, one versus another? Strategic benchmarking yields a better improvement rate versus internal benchmarking. This is because it eliminates internal bias, and it eliminates the ability for you to kind of work in a vacuum and have blinders on as to what the best process may be. Now, the cons, really diverse cultures. I'm comparing here to companies of similar spend, but if I'm comparing against companies of similar spend and, you know, there's just a mix of cultural influences, it could be very misleading. Now, need for specificity. This boils down to the fact that because it's a metrics-based comparison, you need to specify and have common things in common. So the same airline, the same markets, you're looking at things based on preferred vendors, et cetera. If you're looking at a property level and you're saying, what's my benchmark compared to others at this property, that specificity could fail you, right? There may not be as many people as you would think using that particular property. And then we are unique. So this is a syndrome of selling benchmarks internally. So when you go to share benchmarks internally, strategic benchmarks specifically, because they look at such a broad set of information, tend to lead people to question them because they will innately say things like, yes, but this is compared against all different industries, and we are very unique within our industry. And as an intelligence person who's worked in data in many industries in my career, I can tell you people are not as unique as you think. There are very serious commonalities across industry that apply. So some of that is really about debunking and also having multiple levels of benchmarking to support your argument for or against a specific measure or policy or rule. All right, so the use case. Here we're looking at identifying and analyzing the best in class. It's used when a company also needs to go outside of its own industry, which could happen for a number of reasons. Maybe you're a new entrant to the industry, and you're much smaller than all of your competitors. Or, you know, maybe you need to go outside of your industry because your industry is a very established industry with really high expenses, and you're trying to drive a different way. You're trying to look at low cost, for example. It's also used to establish goals relative to benchmarks set in best-in-class companies. So strategic benchmarking is all about comparing to other companies outside of your industry that, you know, may have a best-in-class approach. Here I'm looking at specific city pairs, my company versus the benchmark, and getting a sense of just what an individual flight between those 2 points costs on average.
Hey, Kate, I have a question for you
Sure.
on the previous slide, if you don't mind me asking. When you talk about benchmarking being something that that you can have, internally, externally, same industry, not same industry, uh, help help the help our clients on the call today understand um, why does one even need to do that? Like, what is the value and the benefit in its in a simple response here? So, if I don't do that today, right, and I'm managing my costs and I feel like I'm doing a fairly good job, what value do I get by looking at other companies in my industry or other companies that spend about the same travel amount as I do?
Right. So, it's like anything in life, right? Without an external comparison, sometimes we get blinders on to what we're doing and whether or not our specific approach is working. So, and I can give you an example. I was working many years ago before benchmarks were really prevalent and benchmark tools were prevalent in our travel industry. Um, I worked at a TMC and we had two clients that came together and they were in the same industry. They were both really well known in their industry. They were similar size. They had similar business structures. They even shared some executive leadership that had branched off. So that, two peas in a pod, right? Now, they both believed that they were managing their travel program to the full extent that they possibly could. And when we started looking at them together and benchmarking them against each other, we learned that in certain markets, there were massive differences in cost, huge, tens of thousands of dollars on average for a trip. And we started to ask why, what's driving that? And it was behavioral. It was that they had some VIPs in one company, and the culture was such that they allowed people to fly to let's say Boston to Hong Kong direct on Cathay, first class, last minute, stay at high tier hotels. Like there was just sky the limit approach, where the other company had a much different approach. And they would actually use long haul trips as an excuse to stop in with different clients in Europe, take multiple hops, stay in, moderately priced hotels. So the average cost per trip at the kind of VIP level within those two companies was so incredibly different that they had absolutely different trends in travel and costs and budgeting. Now, internally, if had never compared outside of each other or to each other, they would have never known that there was a room for improvement. So it's really having that external yardstick.
So I think the room for improvement part is the key there, right? Because by doing the comparison, you now start to say, okay, well, why am I not comparing, why are my numbers so much higher? Or in some cases, you might say, well, hey, my number is actually lower than the benchmark. In your example there, JFK LAX in the middle of the screen there, as a way to measure that, okay, we're doing well in this city pair or in our travel program.
Right. And then there's room to consider other factors. If JFK LAX is one of your core markets and it's something you're going to be using as a flight more and more often, then that's going to benefit you to a great deal. Maybe you're using LAX as an entry point for the rest of the world and you're growing globally. So it helps you look at your planning factors as well. I always love your questions, Ash, because you keep me on my toes. Just saying. All right, so competitive benchmarking. So competitive benchmarking is a comparison between two processes inside your industry. So like for like, let's look at travel within the industry and compare by whatever measure, by cabin, by market. Now, when you compare companies in the same industry, you can also compare by similar spend and policy. So in Prime, you can select multiple benchmarks. So you can actually look at just the industry as a whole, or also by spend and policy. It'll create a smaller benchmark, but it's a very specific benchmark that allows you to know your competition, right? And then really kind of stack up apples to apples. Another pro is similar regulatory issues. So within the same industry, you may have the same regulations and kind of restrictions on how you operate. It's very useful for goals and planning. So looking at the industry to set a generic goal and then refining it over time. Cons, it may be misleading, right? Looking at the industry may be very similar to looking at just yourself, depending on the kind of homogenization within your industry. And it may not provide best-in-class comparisons. So whereas strategic benchmarking allows you to look at the widest possible set and pick the absolute best-in-class comparison to mark to, this may not. This may be too like for like. And then competitive benchmarking as a use case. So it's used to evaluate your position within your industry. So it's really helpful for understanding where you fall. It helps you identify performance targets within the industry and set those goals. It can be used in conjunction with strategic benchmarking. So you can use competitive benchmarks and strategic benchmarks to kind of drive a complete story, right? This is how we're doing within the confines of our industry. This is how we're doing against a wider markets overall. And you can also look at internal versus external. So what do I mean by that? External benchmarking competitively has to do with comparing against companies to the industry, your company as a whole to some external source. Internally, you can use competitive benchmarking to look at a department against the whole, and then compare that department's averages to the industry itself. So it takes a little bit more planning, it takes a little bit more execution, but it becomes a very kind of interesting way to look at using an internal competitive benchmark, right? Setting a goal and then taking that internal perspective, one department, and looking at them against the industry. And here I'm looking at the company versus the benchmark, where the benchmark is the industry competitors just by month in a really high level kind of, factor, and if I saw a month with an outlier, I might drill into that and then look at how each department is doing within that month, if there are any outliers, if there are certain markets, maybe there was an event, what are the drivers behind it? All right, so generic benchmarking. Broadly conceptualizes unrelated business processes that can be practiced in the same or similar way regardless of the industry. It's really about comparing metrics to the widest available set or many sets of data. Generic benchmarking doesn't require benchmark data. So what I'm actually showing you here is a series of airlines, and I'm not showing an actual benchmark comparison. I'm just looking at the metrics. What are the averages from my company's perspective? What are my average costs for these airlines? Looking at just a metrics-based approach gives you a broad perspective. It allows potential for discovery of specific trends. And it naturally encompasses multiple industries because you're looking at yourself on average, but the comparisons you pull in will naturally include multiple industries. The cons, market-wide fluctuations can impact. So using our current times as an example, market-wide fluctuations in the cost of travel and market availability are going to impact your average costs right now and maybe not be a good baseline for you to compare against long-term. And it's hard to identify best in class. If I'm only looking at my own averages, my own metrics, I have no way to compare. I have no external yardstick. However, when we look at our use cases, so this is used to establish your baseline. Right? Same kind of approach from phase one where we talked about categorical baseline, looking at your program as a whole. It provides an understanding of trends or process regardless of industry or size. So what are the trends and averages in New York versus Dallas? It's really helpful when there's no clear comparison or you are the benchmark. And what do I mean by that? What if you're the benchmark? What if you are so large and you dominate your industry or a few markets? When that happens, what you need to do is make sure your benchmarks exclude you. because you will weight them, you will skew them. And we do that in Prime. That's part of how we function. The other thing you need to do is kind of take a step back, right? So in this case, you're going to look at, maybe in one market, you're going to look at your internal benchmarks. How am I doing in this market against myself? You're going to look at strategic benchmarks with a market focus. How am I doing in these markets against other companies in my industry or similar spend or both? Then you're going to look at the generic benchmarks and the metrics to measure your program. So you're going to look at average fare, cost per mile, and cost per mile versus operating cost per mile, which is an external metric published by the airlines to understand how close you could possibly get to the lowest cost, which is what the airlines operate at per mile in the market you dominate. So when you dominate a specific market, when you are the benchmark, there's kind of a special approach you should take. All right, so all good information, right? But let's make sense of a little bit what matters for travel. So what benchmark types matter in travel? It all depends on your program, your policy, and your business culture. So your company's culture and how you approach benchmarking is dependent on many factors. If you're a low-cost culture, you would benchmark based on similar spend and online bookings, perhaps, agent versus online, kind of always driving to the cheapest, most efficient mechanism for booking. If you're competitive, you would use internal benchmarks to compare departments to the company as a whole. You'd create goals and rewards for being the best department. So Ash and I had a conversation about this, and we came up with some kind of core company cultures in travel. So there's a low-cost culture where cost avoidance is key. There's low fare kind of favored over convenience, which is compliance-driven, where policy trumps personal choice. And the cost drivers there are to maintain the lowest average cost. There's a traveler-centric approach, right, where comfort and convenience matter over cost, where personal choice is favored over policy, and everything is driven by employee satisfaction. There's a competitive culture where you're consciously trying to beat the average and be the best, whether that's in your industry or a specific department or in your program for travel. Compliance and policy tend to be moderately enforced in these types of companies because there's some wiggle room. The cost drivers here is that higher cost is okay if results are delivered. If you're a super competitive company and you set a target that you're going to increase revenues by 150% in year 2, then you might spend more money to achieve that, and that's okay, right? Strategic mosaic. So strategic is a mix of compliance, traveler satisfaction, and cost. It's a blended approach, and it's really based on traveler roles. It's also centered around strategic procurement practices. We're using a mix of KPIs to establish the best in class. Now, we can, just like we can as human beings, we can kind of float between these 4 cultures at different points for different purposes, but in general, there's one that drives a company. So given that.
Yeah. So with that, we'd like to get your feedback on what kind of a culture do you all are you all in today, and what best identifies your company culture given these options. And of course, we provided an option none of the above in case any of you thought that one of these choices were not reflective of your organization. And so I'm very interested to see what you all put in, and this is something that we're going to talk a lot more about, because there is a relationship to what kind of culture your organization is to how you approach travel, how you approach benchmarking, how you approach the overall nature of how you view travel. So and we think that these 4 cover all of them, but we've been wrong before, right, Kate? So we were open to hearing if anybody felt that there was none of the above. But these 4, I think, represent the options that Kate and I discussed. So I'm curious to see what the results look like. And whenever, Taylor, you're ready, we can post that up on the screen. So Kate, question for you. So since we talked about this, have you thought about any others?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a, as there's like a newbie one, right? Like we're as yet unmanaged, we're new to this, right? Because I've seen
Yeah,
that quite a bit, where people they maybe don't have data consolidation practices, or they're not doing a ton of analytics today. So they don't really know, or they haven't really analyzed it from a travel perspective. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So, well, look at the results. A lot of you are low cost driven, which is not a good thing. I'm kidding. That's not a bad thing either. But 71% are coming back with low cost. 7% are competitive. 7% traveler centric, and 14% are strategic or mosaic in Kate's words. So, and none of you actually chose anything. None of you picked none of the above. So we might be onto something. I think we'll try these polls in other environments, and let's see if we can find any others. But if we don't, then I think that there is a benefit here, Kate, as we have discussed, where we can take this idea and almost create a benchmark category that reflects one of these four, right? So now when you're benchmarking, not only are you benchmarking based on some of the criteria that you've discussed, but now you can very easily say, okay, I'm a low-cost company. I want to benchmark myself against like low-cost companies, or I'm a competitive company. I have a competitive culture, so therefore I want to benchmark myself against competitive companies who have a similar culture.
Mhm. Yeah,
What's
absolutely.
your thoughts on this?
My initial thought, if I'm being honest, as a sociologist, true to my heart, is
Yeah.
that we might have some audience bias because folks that are in folks that work with a travel management company that are in a managed travel mindset, more
Hmm.
more predominantly, I think, would be low cost in terms of culture. I think that we might have bias in our audience, and that it would be an interesting thing um, to ask people who are unmanaged, because I think that they might have different drivers. That's my that's my
Okay.
gut instinct on that one.
Maybe next time we'll do a poll where we ask what kind of company culture would you like to be,
Right?
right?
Exactly.
So Taylor, make a
Um,
note of that one. Back to you, Kate.
and and I think having a low cost culture mindset is by far the dominant response, and especially you know I think because it's managed, but also because a lot of times that's how things are measured. Now, it doesn't mean that you only need to use one perspective, right? However, it does indicate the benchmark that you might prefer, and what goals and metrics are going to matter to your program, right? So, low cost, 100%. The 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 baseline for that is looking by similar spend, and then using a mixture of goals and metrics that focus on low fare and average rate performance, whether that's for specific vendors and carriers and agreements or not. Um, Competitive, you would want to focus by industry, looking at period over period, and then compare any selected metrics by hierarchy. So looking at department level performance. Traveler centric. So if you're traveler centric, it means you could really use any benchmark as needed. But the focus would be on metrics that show use of perks like higher tier hotels or business class travel internationally, right? Strategic and mosaic, again, could use any of the benchmarks and the benchmark types, and use a variety of metrics to measure based on a focus, like preferred vendor usage or online adoption. And I also find that strategic, the approach is to pick a focus and improve on that, and then pick the next focus, which is a really good strategy, even if you're low cost, right? So as a low cost culture, you might want to pick, those metrics and goals that matter to you. And then as they hit a goal, or they are improved, move to the next one. You can learn a lot from that strategic procurement approach of kind of focusing on a specific element and then improving it and building on that success. All right. So the metrics in travel. So as complex as all of this can be, right? The metrics available in travel are very simple, right? There are things like average and total segment cost. What is the cost per flight, right? What's your ticket cost or trip cost, right? What is your cost per mile, your night, per stay, per day? So the metrics, the way we measure, very, very simple. Then those things can be measured across groupings like city pair or airline, class of service, booking tool, property, vendor, or hierarchy. I like to mention this because I feel like there are times when all of this can really become overwhelming. And it's important to remember that there's only so many levers that you can manipulate to really understand the pattern. So it kind of simplifies it. So what metrics don't tell you? So metrics are never the whole story, right? They're only indicators of a bigger story. And I have this really big pie chart to demonstrate that. This is showing average fare, but it has no context, right? So based on what? Based on cabin, based on market, based on the role of the traveler? We don't know. And even in a strict low fare policy driven company, right, we have to dig into the numbers and look at what's behind this. If I'm looking at this fare for this particular traveler, there are only 2 flights. This is essentially one trip. This is a really high cost. The total spend was $22,000 for this one trip. But what we don't know is that, this traveler is a road warrior that really drives revenue, that this trip landed us the biggest client we got this year, right? So those are the things, the context, right? The human nature behind the metrics. Whereas if we look here, this traveler had the same total spend, 10 different flights, roughly 5 trips, didn't sell a thing, right? So metrics just don't tell you everything. I wish they did, but they don't. And mind the gaps. So gaps can exist in your data or variances in your travel program, right? For success, you really have to mine those things and be able to account for them. So in Prime, on our criteria page again, you can select specific departments, but you can also filter. So for the example here, I'm filtering on VIPs. VIPs for my company travel with a completely different set of rules than everybody else. So therefore, blending them into the comparison for my benchmarking is going to skew my numbers and kind of lead me to inaccurate conclusions. So you have to be able to mine these things. You have to be able to look at traveler role, rule class, department, and include or exclude people accordingly. All right, so getting started. The first step is just to document, right? So your current baseline that we learned in part 1, any gaps or areas of concern, areas of focus that you want to improve, right? Reach out to your client services manager. Have a collaborative discussion about what's ideal for your program, right? Together, outline what benchmarks and metrics you're going to use to measure your improvement over time. You can write a high-level plan, just a few words, right? So we'll benchmark against industry and travel spend across all industries in 5 key markets. And departments will be measured on how close to the overall company benchmark their team is quarterly. And I know it sounds hokey, but writing things down and having a plan and executing on it is really critical, because that plan will inform other people that you've put the work into it, you've thought about it, and you're executing on it. All right. The second step is just do it, right? Use that plan as a guide, analyze and review the benchmarks and metrics that matter to your program, using those tools we learned in phase 1 in analytics and goal setting. Gather the data and reports and analysis in support of your plan. So there's a hint. We actually have a tool for this embedded in Prime Analytics called benchmark analysis. It's going to make it really easy. And then start small, focus on one area at a time, and grow a practice of continual improvement. And the last step, communicate, right? So share your plan with your stakeholders. Your plan is the process goals, performance metrics, and expected results. Everybody loves data and benchmarking. I'm convinced of it, because otherwise I wouldn't have had so much success in my career. But if you share your plan and the metrics and the reports behind it, the analytics, and you start telling that story, you will have greater success, because you'll have buy-in and you'll have an understanding of kind of how you're progressing and improving over time. All right, so key takeaways here today. Different types of benchmarks tell you different things, right? That's what we've discussed in a nutshell. Each type is useful on its own or in conjunction with others, depending on your culture. Be aware of and mind the gaps, right? Policy variations in your program by department will kind of be obstacles sometimes, but if you mind them, you will definitely succeed. And just do it. So start small and build, and the objective is continuous improvement. So with that, we will wrap up what the content for today.
Thank you so much, Kate. I want to thank you for being here and for representing Prime Numbers Technology. It was a really great and informative session. And I want to thank all the attendees and also Ash as well for sharing information from the JTB side of things. We're not done just yet. As Kate did highlight, there are some next steps, but I just want to remind you of what those are. And you'll see that there on your screen. So what you want to do next is you want to speak to your client services manager. They're, of course, happy to help you and guide you through this process. And you want to schedule a one-on-one meeting so that you can take a deeper dive into this service in line with your company's specific needs, because of course every company will have them. So you want to make sure that you take the time to do that. So just a little bit of homework and next steps for all of you. I want to thank everyone for attending this session, and thank you again to our tech talkers. Thank you, Ash and Kate. As you can all see on your screen, we have another great Tech Talks planned for July 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And this time we'll be welcoming back SAP Concur for that session with the focus of expense management. And I'd also like to make mention, of course, of the third and final part of our Tech Talk series with prime numbers, and that will be taking place on Wednesday, August 5th. The focus on that will be expense analysis. I'm sensing a theme here. But I'm sure that's not the last time we'll have prime numbers technology with us, but that part is the wrap up of this special series. So I highly recommend registering for that session and also others with the same link that you used to register for this session. You won't want to miss them. Now, as mentioned, we wanted to conclude with a question and answer portion. For the sake of time, we've selected just 3 questions to answer. So if you don't hear your question answered, don't worry, we'll follow up with you directly later on. So, Kate, the first question I would like to ask, who would you recommend should be part of the benchmarking team?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. In terms of business stakeholders, I'm assuming the question, right? So the benchmarking team should usually be your client services manager and your travel manager or head of procurement, right? Working together because you have your established baseline, you have goals that you've set together, and this is an extension of that. And then your stakeholders kind of should depend on your company, right? So if you're super competitive and you're driving based on department measurement, include and engage with your department heads. If you're low cost and you get the kind of dictation from above where your C-level is telling you we are going to cut costs, then I would include the C-levels as a recipient of the results. But most definitely, it's a collaboration between, your client services manager and whoever is leading your travel program within your company to start with.
I really like how you connected that answer to the cultures, Kate. That was very well done.
Yeah, I think it's important. It's your stakeholders. It varies so much depending on your company, the buy-in, the interest in travel, the focus it gets. And I think doing a good plan and executing it and communicating it even beyond your primary stakeholders will kind of drive more engagement within your company in the travel program.
Okay, great. Thank you. And second question, going back to strategic benchmarking, the pros and cons there. You mentioned the we are unique syndrome. What are your suggestions on overcoming that?
Yeah, so the best way to overcome that is to basically show people the numbers, show people that, we're not so unique. Look at things from a travel-centric perspective. So take it back to looking at a wider benchmark, right? Look at outside of your kind of industry. Look by spend, look strategically, and then look by industry and compare them. So look at the same markets both ways, by industry and by spend. Look at other factors and speak to the fact that sometimes it's better to have an external comparison that, drives away from that, industry specific focus. And one of the great examples there is retail, right? So there is a huge difference between a retail company that is a, bargain basement, like I remember Filene's Basement in Boston, right? Huge difference between Filene's Basement and a luxury brand like Coach. They're going to function very differently in the same industry. So while the industry may have unique elements, you want to kind of back into that argument by saying, let's look at the external sources and compare and find a best practice example outside of your industry to kind of battle that mindset.
That's a great suggestion. And actually, you mentioned real life example, and I believe you also spoke of one earlier, but this next question plays to asking for another example. So when a company decides to use benchmarking, what is the most common mistake they make, and how do you suggest that be avoided?
Ah, so one of the most common mistakes that I hear of is, and I hear this feedback from services managers and others who say things like, um, so we were looking at the benchmarks and there was a lot of red where, the client wasn't really doing well, and they don't want to see that. They don't want to see that because it doesn't speak well for them. And my argument there is you may see a lot of red. You may be in a point in your industry where you're doing fabulously compared to your industry, but compared to a wider market, there's room for improvement. So don't let kind of the negative story kind of discourage you from turning it around and saying, you know what, we've uncovered this as an issue and we're going to approach it. So I think people tend to put blinders on and not want to see the kind of bad side of it or the negative story because they feel like it speaks poorly to their performance. I look at it as an opportunity for improvement and say, we found this and we're going to do something about it. So it's about how you adapt to kind of that mindset. But that's the number one issue I've seen is people just don't like to see a lot of red on the screen. No pun intended for the JTB red, Josh.
Yeah, we love red here at JTB. I actually would like to ask a question for me to you, Kate, and this is more of a general philosophical kind of a question. I think you like these kind of questions. So it is my belief that if you opened up every travel policy of every company in the world and allowed all the travelers to do whatever they wanted, okay, in a managed environment. So obviously, when I'm not talking about booking travel on places where you cannot gather numbers and analytics and things like that, I'm talking about, using a online booking tool, a proper process that if you did that, you would find that 90% plus of your traveling employees would actually benchmark against a company that would be a low-cost culture. Because if you provide instruction and if you provide direction well, that your employees will only go outside of that when they are in a situation when they need to or they must. What do you think about that statement? Do you think that it's a valid statement? Do you think it's totally off the grid, or is it something that's worth exploring?
I think it's probably valid, but I think there are reasons why. So most people do want to do the right thing. Not that everybody's a rule follower. I have a husband who travels significantly for his job, and he's in field service, and he hates booking through channel, and I yell at him all the time. But books direct. But I think most people want to follow the policy and the rules. And in today's world, a lot of people are, you know, that's enforced in multiple ways through expense reimbursement and other things. But I also think that I don't know that 90% would be the number. I think that I would hazard a guess it's closer to 75% of people. I think the 25% is probably driven by not that people don't want to follow the rules, but that the rules are enforced in a way that make it either difficult or more like morale is in such a way that it makes it difficult. So one of the things I've found in my career to be absolutely true, and I know this is going to sound like gamification, but I'm an anti-gamification person, is that if you reward good behavior, it doesn't need to be monetary or financial or a game. If you simply uh, acknowledge people who are doing what you want in a positive way publicly, other people will conform. So I think the 25% gap that I believe exists versus the 10% gap you believe exists is because 25% of the time, companies aren't doing that actively. So they're saying this is the rule, but they're not saying, hey, thanks for following the rule. That's a great example. We appreciate that. Just doing that is enough to kind of shift that.
Excellent.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of you. And it's been a really great session, but we are running up on time here. So I would say at this point, that brings us to the end of our session. I want to thank both Ash and Kate. Thank you for being here and representing Prime Numbers Technology and making it a very informative and enjoyable session. Thank you to our audience for taking the time out to be here today. We at JTB Business Travel are very pleased to have hosted this session along with Prime Numbers Technology. We hope that you've all thoroughly enjoyed and benefited from what's been presented today, and we are looking forward to being with you again live at our next Tech Talks. Have a great day.
Thanks.